have the pleasure and the honor of introducing a colleague and long-term friend of mine, Karen Matthews. Professor Matthews is a distinguished professor of psychiatry, epidemiology, psychology, quite a number of things at the University of Pittsburgh. And one of the things that's quite nice about what we're doing with the Honoris Conference is we're marrying it with an annual Bronfenbrenner lecture. And that actually makes a lot of sense because those of you in Honoris are, of course, well aware that what most of us are interested in at some level has something to do with poverty, inequality, social consequences of growing up and children's development, both physically and psychologically. And one of the things that Yuri Bronfenbrenner talked a lot about was this concept of social address. And what he meant by that was psychologists and many other social scientists, but particularly psychologists, for many, many years treated things like socioeconomic status, class, income, occupation as sort of a large thing out there in the what Yuri would call the macro system, this sort of environmental context that was just a structural phenomenon. I mean, psychologists, of course, recognized that there were links between poverty and health and well-being, but they really didn't, as Yuri would say, unpack it. So what Yuri was very interested in this, and very much some of the origins of his theory of the bioecology of child development, human development that many of us know, he was very interested in unpacking larger phenomena like culture, like race, like ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. So this conference is organized really very much around that principle of unpacking. So what we're going to do today is Professor Matthews is going to begin to introduce us to how might you unpack some of the biological, physiological processes that might help us understand links between social disadvantage and growing up. So I'm happy to introduce Professor Karen Matthews, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this lecture in honor of Yuri Bronfenbrenner. It's a real honor, and I am very pleased to visit this gorgeous campus, especially when it's this time of year and just full of life and greenery and a joy to be here. I wanted to say just a few remarks before we get started. I studied in graduate school with an experimental social psychologist named David Glass. And David Glass was very interested in the impact of urban stress on people's physiology and development, and got interested in type A behavior, which at the time was becoming known to be a potential risk factor for heart disease. And while I was in training, he said, you know, you really got to read some of Yuri Bronfenbrenner's work because it has a big impact on how we think about individual behavior. And so, in fact, that was my first introduction to his work. And I've been very appreciative of having that perspective in my own work over the years. I was given the task of trying to lay out some of the key biological pathways that might be important to understanding connections between the social environment and children's health. And this is really a daunting task because there's so many things that impinge on children's development that are important in this context. So as you will see, I have picked several to concentrate on, but these are really several of the more important ones in my mind at this point in our understanding, and there's many others as well. So when I speak to audiences, I like them to see Pittsburgh. So I pick one slide just so you can see how beautiful Pittsburgh is, and this is downtown Pittsburgh. And the reason I picked this particular one is partly because of the last time I got to attend a meeting of this group, I was in Rotterdam, and the artist who made this rubber ducky is actually Dutch. And his name is Hoffman. The first name I can't pronounce, something like Florentine Hoffman. And he had a message of healing that he felt was reflected in children's activities and playthings and so forth. So he created these ducks. and put them in different harbors around the world. And Pittsburgh was the first American city to have this rubber ducky. Now, this rubber ducky was visited within 1 month in the year 2013 by over 1 million people in downtown Pittsburgh. And I was actually there myself. I was one of the 1 million. And at night, you could see flashes. It was like this was a celebrity or a movie star, people taking photos of this rubber ducky. So I hope you'll come visit someday, because it's a special place. So just to give you an overview of my talk, I'm going to start out with some basics, because so many of us have different backgrounds and came to this talk for different reasons. So I'm going to discuss and define some basic terms. And then I'm going to review some key environmental exposures that are correlated with poverty and low socioeconomic status. I will, as I said, focus on several pathways, and not all the important ones, but several that I know a little more about, and talk about a few ideas about what's next. So, health disparities, what do we mean by that? And it means a lot of different things to people. So I personally like this definition that was offered by Paula Braverman, that systematic, plausibly avoidable health differences affecting subgroups of populations. Some definitions do concentrate on disadvantaged groups. And finally, this definition highlights the importance of prevention or intervention, in that it's a focus on things that are potentially changeable. And I think that's a positive message for us to think about. What do we mean by socioeconomic status? Well, it's overlapping concept, but not the same. It refers to typically one's social position linked to both access to resources in the environment, as well as prestige or rank order in the social hierarchy. And there's quite a few measures that are used in this field, most commonly education, occupational rank, income, but other subjective measures come into play, as well as variability in income over time, wealth, which is very important because there are some groups that have adequate funds for now but don't have any resources to fall back on when there's emergencies, and finally downward and upward mobility, which has gotten a lot of attention because of the recent recession. This is a slide that demonstrates that, in fact, access to resources and rank don't necessarily co-vary. And in fact, in this case, the monks are rather low on resources, but they do anticipate an increase in rank over time, and with death, I guess. So how is poverty defined in the United States? The definition is actually quite interesting to read about on the census government site. It's definition based on gross income relative to the size of the family household, number of children under 18, as well as the age of adults over 65. It's based actually on a nutritional analysis, the needs of families for adequate nutrition based on work in the 1960s. And if you go to the website, you can actually see an original memo of this particular report. It was done by one woman over a couple of years. So this is actually the basis of the current understanding of poverty. The thresholds are updated every year for inflation, but do not vary by area. And now, of course, housing is such a big factor in determining the actual use of income, and this does not reflect household location at all. An example for a family of 4 with 2 children in 2016 is a little over $24,000. So that gives you an idea of the source. Now, lots of people have been critical of this particular definition of poverty, and we'll get to that in a moment. Who lives below the poverty line in the United States? Well, there's about 20% of children in the United States who live below poverty, and that amounts to 14 million people or so, 14 million children. And as you can see from this chart, it really is a key problem for Hispanics as well as blacks. So disproportionately, minorities are affected by poverty. How is poverty defined internationally? Well, the World Bank accepts a level of personal income below a certain government standard, and so it does say that that is a reasonable way to define poverty internationally. Other ways that are important to consider are what's called a basic needs indicator, including adequate food, safe drinking water, sanitation, health services, shelter, adequate education, and information access. And then there's finally a capability approach at the societal level, which says, in this country, what would it take to have adequate sanitation, or what would it take to have adequate nutrition? And so it standardizes, basically, the poverty line individually according to the country's capacities. So there are many, many, many children who live in absolute poverty in the developing world. This is a slide that was taken from a report in which they evaluated the percentage of children and numbers of children in absolute poverty, in this case defined as having at least two areas of deprivation. And for example, it would be malnutrition, no sanitation facilities, in or near building, and for those children who are 7 or older, no primary or secondary education. So you can see in the developing countries across the world, 37% of children are living in absolute poverty, defined at least by two of these indicators, with the worst experiences in sub-Saharan Africa. So we know that poverty has devastating effects on children's health and is correlated with poor health in children. This is from an amazing literature review of 126 observational studies published from 1991 to 2013, mainly cross-sectional analyses, and it looked at individual level socioeconomic status and used clinical cutoffs. And what I want to point out to you is the first line of all-cause disabling chronic conditions associated with low SES, and that's defined as lasting 6 months with a significant activity limitation. And you can see that, in fact, the odds ratio is about 72% more likely to have this be in that condition if, in fact, they're from low SES environments. And these are for developed countries, primarily. And there is the issue, because it's cross-sectional, whether or not low SES is a cause or a consequence of poor childhood health. Because you can imagine that if you had a child with cerebral palsy or epilepsy or congenital abnormalities, that could drain the family's income as well and cause the family to decline over time in SES. And the authors call for longitudinal data, which they're now emerging as well. So what do we mean by mechanisms or pathways? So usually we think about what factors might help us understand the connections between two variables. And often this is a statistical manipulation, but it also is a conceptual manipulation. So what do we think are the key things that may be important? This example is low SES is related to cognitive performance and brain structure, and we'll talk a little bit about brain measures later on. And one hypothesis as a pathway is that toxins are an intermediate pathway, that children who grow up in low SES environments or in poverty are exposed to more toxins in their environment, and that in turn impacts their cognitive performance and brain structure. But it also could serve as a moderator, and there is indeed some evidence that that toxins behave differently in different SES groups. For example, environmental tobacco smoke has greater effects on children's cognitive outcomes in lower SES families. And there's some evidence that genes are more highly determinant of IQ in high SES children than low SES children, suggesting that the environment may play a bigger role in low SES environments. So that's the basics. So now we'll move on to key environmental exposures correlated with poverty and low SES. Now, as you can imagine, poverty in childhood is not simply low income relative to needs, but also exposure to disadvantaged environments more generally. And this comes from work by Gary and Kim on looking at the associations of poverty in children with cumulative risks. And cumulative risks in this analysis was defined as family turmoil, exposure to community violence, early childhood separation, substandard housing, noise, and crowding. And 65% of the median income children in their analysis had 0 or 1 of these particular exposures, whereas the poor, on average, had 3 to 4. So the point is that there's a lot of baggage that goes along with poverty as defined by income, and that it really reflects an entire set of exposures that are disadvantaged exposures for children. So you can walk with me through a thought experiment here. This is a chapter that Sheldon Cohen, Edith Chen, and I wrote, and tried to examine the potential environmental exposures that may be associated with outcomes, biological outcomes of interest to understand the SES health connection. And we divided it really very much like, I think, what Bronfenbrenner would like, into considering what's in the home, what's in the neighborhood, and what's in the school setting. And then secondly, what are more physical and what are more psychosocial? And this is really arbitrary classification because they do blend together. And what you can see, maybe, I see some squinting way in the back, is let's just do home first. So physical, more exposure to toxins, low housing quality, more density of living space. In the neighborhood, low air and water quality, public spaces are few, or noise, and fewer good food options. In the school setting, the conditions of the building and the grounds. Under the psychosocial aspects, we would consider more likelihood in the home of less warmth, more conflict, more potential for abuse and neglect due to financial stress, pretty much, and that the parents' health habits may not be as good. So in the neighborhood, what would we imagine? Crime, violence, social capital, meaning low social cohesion in the neighborhood. And then finally, under the school climate, the disorder in the classroom, usually due to less money to have sufficient number of teachers or teacher aides, and low quality of education. So you can imagine that this environment would not be conducive to positive children's health. So I'm going to focus on several important biological pathways next. A number of the theories of how low SES or poverty gets under the skin of children have to do with exposure to chronic stress. And as soon as you say that, then in fact what we think of is the sympathetic nervous system activation and the HPA axis as well. And this particular paper was written in context of cardiovascular disease, which is it's actually my specialty. But it outlines, I think, things that are important for many of the kinds of illnesses that impact children or adults, for that matter. And you can see that these authors identified two kinds of stressors, the more physical and the more emotional. And if we just walk down through this map, you can see that the emotional stressors impact the cerebral cortex, which in turn impacts the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, of course, activates through CRH the pituitary and then goes down eventually to the adrenal cortex, releasing cortisol. Before we get to the bottom, let's do the physical stressor side. Physical stressors in this simple model are affecting the brainstem and the hypothalamus, and then sympathetic nervous system impacts the adrenal medulla, releasing catecholamines. There's also a separate system affecting the periphery. And then we get down to the bottom. Now, on the bottom, it shows on your right the things that are thought to be impacted by cortisol directly, and that would be central adiposity, or waist around the middle, inflammation, which is actually lowered acutely with high levels of cortisol, and intravascular volume, which can increase blood pressure. And on the right side, things that are acutely affected by the sympathetic nervous system activation are increases in heart rate, withdrawal of the parasympathetic nervous system as indicated by heart rate variability, increase in interleukin-6, and then arrhythmias in those individuals who have vulnerable hearts. And then finally, both axes are thought to affect insulin resistance, blood pressure, coagulation of the blood, and endothelial dysfunction. Endothelial dysfunction is simply the elasticity of the artery, making it harder to respond to acute changes in blood flow. So makes sense that this should be important, even in childhood, and especially in adolescence. And then this is from Dr. Slokin's work that she's going to probably talk about a little more later. And it's a graph I like very much because it lays out the immune side in more detail than the other graph that I showed you. And this, again, the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis are thought to affect inflammation, coagulation, and adhesion of the molecules through the cytokines impacting the liver, and then you get the acute phase response of the liver, which impacts inflammation as well. And then on the immune side, you can see that it impacts the number of the antibodies for common infections, natural killer cells, and the various CD4/857s. So there's lots of plausible biological mechanisms that seem to connect things that we think are correlated with low SES in poverty. Now, which child pathways do I want to spend a little more time with? Well, I thought about this because when I was asked to give this talk, I realized that one could spend an entire semester on this topic. And what I thought I would think about, and I hope this makes sense to you, what are the things that are a little more prevalent in children, especially children from low SES backgrounds? What things might be related to other important health outcomes? And then are these child health pathways linked to adult health? Because really we are talking about a lifespan perspective. You know, what happens in children and how does that set a platform for later on in life? And then finally, I think there's beginning to be a sense that some of these pathways and health outcomes are interrelated to one another, and so maybe we should consider how they relate and whether they have common exposures that are intermediate. So given that, I decided to concentrate on three areas. One is obesity and cardiometabolic factors. The second is sleep. And the third is brain development. And I'm going to spend more time on the first two than the last, partly because the last is really an exciting new set of findings and is very active. And also we have an excellent discussant who will probably be talking a bit more about that as well as some of the presentations later in this meeting. So let's start with the obesity cardiometabolic. The American Heart Association in 2010 issued a statement written by a blue ribbon panel of very distinguished scientists. And this was very exciting to me personally because it was a clear statement that we need to go back in time and consider what's going on early in life as well as in adulthood. So I call your attention to the middle. Primordial prevention has relevance and urgency today in the high-income nations of today. Given the substantial burden of obesity and the adverse health behaviors and environment. And so that was a key thing, that they also included the environment, that often begin in childhood and are present in most high-income nations, especially the United States. So here is a slide that shows the percentage of childhood population that are overweight as well as obese combined using the International Obesity Task Force cutoffs. And there's several interesting features, I think, of this particular slide. First of all, the rates are very high in all these countries. And secondly, they're increasing. And you can see these are data from 1974 to 2005. And the United States should be congratulated for being #1, of course. So this week, there was actually another paper that came out in the New England Journal on Wednesday that was also trying to estimate the rate of obesity in children and adults around the world. It was written by a consortium called the Global Burden of Obesity Task Group. They used data from 195 countries, and they said that there were currently, in these 195 countries, 108 million obese children. So it's just enormous. And the interesting part is obviously there's geographical variation in that, because in some countries the real issue is undernutrition, not overnutrition. However, in general, there is increasing over time for the period they evaluated in the rates of obesity. And so it is not a problem that's going to go away. They also estimated, which is not quite on target for our discussion, but I think is really interesting, is they evaluated the health consequences in adults only of obesity. And they found that there were 4 million deaths per year due to obesity. And they evaluated that there was 120 million deaths per year due to disabilities related to obesity. And 70% of the deaths were due to cardiovascular disease. So this is a significant problem. It's very prevalent around the world and in the United States as well. And again, the United States won this contest of sorts. So how would we think about why SES might be related to obesity in children? And using the same kind of schema, you can think about that children who become obese tend to have obese parents. And they tend to have parents who are inactive. In other words, they're not modeling healthy behaviors. There's more family stress in the home. They take fewer meals together and allow more TV watching in the home. By the way, I should say the top part of this slide was taken from work in a paper by Schreier and Chen, if you care to read the original. In the neighborhood, they report data that low SES or impoverished children grow up in areas with less green space. There's more convenience stores as opposed to full grocery stores, less physical activity facilities available, and more crime, which would keep children in the home more likely. And then school, poorer dietary options in cafeterias, fewer physical activity classes, and poor condition of play areas. This physical activity class is being removed. It's really striking, I think, around the United States. I don't know if this is true in other parts of developed countries, but in an effort to control costs, that's often the thing that goes. And in my case, my kids went to a pretty affluent high school They had one semester with 2 days a week of physical activity. And what they taught them was not conditioning, but what they taught them was some sort of sport that they could potentially take and do on their own. But it really is a very different shift than when I was growing up, in that we had physical activity every day and had time outside at recess and so forth. So nonetheless, these things are related or correlated with obesity in children. And as I've told you, obesity is a key factor in increasing insulin resistance, inflammation, and blood pressure. I'm going to take just a few minutes and talk about some of the work that we've done. We've tended, over the last 10, 15 years, study children who are children and adolescents, as well as young adults. And we typically do community samples, so we're not choosing clinic samples. And we evaluate, we've actually screened them out if they have any signs of cardiovascular illnesses. And we study, as much as possible, half blacks and half whites, because of the fact that, first of all, blacks are more likely to be disadvantaged. And secondly, they have early signs of cardiovascular disease, particularly blood pressure, and then early increases in insulin resistance. So the way we have approached our work is we've been guided by a specific model that helps us organize things and gives us a framework for evaluation of connections. So I'll just walk you through this, but I'm not going to spend time trying to demonstrate the connections. But basically, our thought is that low SES or minority status results in being exposed to fewer positive and more negative experiences and events, that other things being that equal, that will lead to fewer positive and more negative emotions and attitudes, and that in turn is related to cardiovascular risk and potentially sleep disturbance. And then those two in our model are also interconnected. And this was a hypothesis that we've been testing, so it wasn't established. And then our notion is that children can grow up, though, with a set of reserves for dealing with adversity, and that essentially they learn over time adaptive ways to deal with that adversity. But in some cases, those adaptive ways are fine for that environment, but when they get out of that environment, they don't work, and that there's a cost of adaptation. But nonetheless, we've been interested in the resources that children learn and can bring to bear on these consequences of their life that they live. So what should we measure if we are interested in studying early cardiovascular risk in children? Well, there's actually a couple of options that are very useful. And one is pulse wave velocity. And that's an indirect measure of stiffness of the vessels. And, excuse me, the reason that's bad is that if stiff vessels actually are a precursor of arteriosclerosis and cannot accommodate as easily to changes in needs for blood flow. So the way we measure it is we put two probes on the body and then measure the distance between the two probes and the length of time it takes for pulses to travel the two probes. And so a higher value in this case indicates stiffer vessels. And you can think about it like a stiff hose, that if you have a stiff hose, that the water goes through it very fast. But if the hose is bent and circling your garden around and around, it'll take longer for the water to go through, but it will take longer, but it will get there eventually just fine. So in fact, it really is a reasonable way to approach measurement in children. It also is linked to risk for cardiovascular disease in adults. So we know from validation studies that that's the case. Another way is to measure the carotid intermedial thickness, and this is a cartoon of it. And you simply measure the thickness of the vessel walls and average them at different locations. And in some children who, usually they have some sort of hyperlipidemia problem, they actually will have some plaque, which is this little bubble that's in the middle of the bulb. But anyway, we can look at this as well. And even in adolescence, we'll see variability in the thickness that tends to vary, by the way, by race. So, a little bit of data. In our samples, low SES is associated with greater vascular stiffness in adolescence. And that's true whether we look at income of the family, educational attainment of the parents, or neighborhood SES as well. Low assets in the family, and in this case, we defined it as low assets as rental of the home, number of cars owned, size of the home, and whether they had insurance policies. And in this case, low assets are also related to carotid intermedial thickness in healthy black and white adolescents. In addition, low SES neighborhoods are associated with higher IMT. So some of the research we've done over the years, it looks at psychophysiological responses to standardized laboratory challenges. And so we'll have them come to a laboratory setting and ask them to count backwards or do a Stroop task or do something like a public speaking. And then we look at the magnitude of the changes that occur in response to those stressors and usually adjusting for the baselines as well. And so I wanted to show you this slide. First look at the bottom. This was taken from a study where we had studied adolescents twice, 3 years apart, and increasing negative events were associated with diastolic blood pressure reactivity. And these events primarily had to do with family stress events that the students reported. And then on the top, you can see that those adolescents that had increasing diastolic reactivity over time, that is across the 3 years, also had higher IMT as well, suggesting that psychophysiologic reactivity in response to stress seems to matter for these adolescents. And we've seen similar patterns in adults as well. Now I'm going to only show you just 1 or 2 slides on protective things because I'm excited about stuff like that. And we've published a series of papers on this. And this one is a recent paper where we asked the question, if positive resources or reserve capacity may protect men who grew up in low SES environments. And we had, in this case, 246 men, black and white, who participated in a laboratory stress protocol. And they had annual measures of family socioeconomic status from the ages of 6 to 16. And we were able to evaluate them because we attached ourselves to the parent study. And we measured psychological resources. In this case, it was a composite of positive affect, optimism, purpose in life, self-esteem, and self-mastery. And from our angle, this really would be the intrapersonal resources that people bring to bear that presumably are the result of developmental experiences. There are also, obviously, interpersonal resources like social support and family support, as well as cultural resources that are important to consider from the broader perspective. Anyway, our findings showed that lower socioeconomic status in childhood was related to prolonged recovery of heart rate and systolic blood pressure post-stress. So during the stress, we actually didn't find any differences in reactivity in this study. But after the stress was over, there was an after effect that showed up where it took them longer to get back to their baseline. And then, interestingly, the associations with prolonged recovery were apparent only among the men with fewer psychological resources. So if you look at the right, you can see that under For the men who grew up in low childhood SES environments, those who had the lowest resources currently were the more likely to take longer to recover post-stressor. So why is this important? Well, there is some reason to think that people can adapt to immediate situations, make it through, and do fine, but that it's after the stress is over that there is, in fact, this effect that shows up, and that people have less energy, less cognitive, more cognitive fatigue to deal with these kinds of situations. So from our perspective, the recovery part is of interest, and you can think about it as a marker of resilience, really, that people who are unable to get back to their baseline are less resilient, and resilience seems to be a key thing. We also know from adult research that adults who are reactive to stress and take longer to recover are more likely to become hypertensive as well as have more heart disease. So reactivity is important, but also recovery. So what about the connection between cardiovascular risk factors and sleep disturbance in children? So we know that sleep is important for many reasons, and we know from adult data that there's a number of health consequences, including poor self-control. And I am married to a husband that does this. He buys almost all his stuff on the internet after I've gone to bed. So I don't know what that's about. All right, so why, again, let's do a thought experiment. Why should low SES be related to sleep? So if there's more conflict in the home, that could carry over to children's sleep. There may be less monitoring of the bedtime, not because parents don't care, but maybe they have one of these families where there's two jobs, or one parent works day and one works night, and so there is a problem, controlling that part, and you figure as a parent, well, if the kid's tired, they'll go to bed. No, they don't go to bed when they should. TV, computer, social media is available very commonly. One of the studies that I did was in a very poor, disadvantaged school, and one of the things I learned right away is that almost every kid had a cell phone in their room. And we recorded, we asked them in this study to record texting and in the middle of the night if they woke up and what they did. And it was remarkable, the number that had these cell phones. And they would have cell phones before they would have a TV. Poor quality heating and cooling, sound insulation. So again, the environment for sleeping is not conducive. In the neighborhood, they may live in noisier neighborhoods and have light pollution, air pollution. And in the school setting, early morning start times, work release programs, truancy is an issue, and poor relationships that all may impact sleep. So what are the health consequences? This is from a meta-analysis that was done with sleep duration and childhood obesity. Most of these studies were self-reported, or parent-reported rather, sleep problems. And in fact, you can see that there is about a 60% increase of obesity if they're short sleep. And some of the very nice work that's been done since this time has been done by Jen McGrath, looking at objective measures of sleep duration and adjusting for total energy intake and a variety of other things, and still finds these associations. So this looks like a pretty solid association, and most of the data for the children are actually longitudinal, which makes it even stronger. So in our own work, we asked the question of whether short sleep duration across 1 week, as measured by actigraphy, was related to a number of risk factors. This shows you our results for blood pressure across 2 24-hour periods. And you can see the shortest sleep on the right is associated with the highest blood pressure, and the longest sleep with the lowest blood pressure. And one of the things that's surprising about this, but not post hoc, is that the highest, the the portion of the day and night that was associated most strongly with sleep duration was the nighttime pressure. So the nighttime pressure was really the thing that drove this association. And there are other data suggesting that nighttime pressure is distinctively higher in blacks and minorities than it is in whites. And nighttime pressure is a particular prognostic indicator of future hypertension. Here are data from the same sample for insulin resistance. And again, you can see that the HOMA index in this case, which is a combination of insulin and glucose, is higher in those adolescents that had shorter sleep. And finally, this is a slide from the same sample looking at CRP, C-reactive protein, a marker of inflammation or chronic inflammation, low level. And you can see that the weeknight sleep duration on the top is associated with elevated CRP and also sleep debt. Now, this sleep debt in this case was is a crude marker of sleep debt. What we did was took the difference between the length of sleep during the week and then on the weekend. And if it was 2 hours or more on the weekend, we figured that they were trying to catch up on their sleep, and we called that sleep debt. There's better ways to measure it, but that was our way to do it. And that also seemed to be related, that those kids who slept at least 2 hours more on the weekend relative to the weekday also had elevated CRP. And this is adjusted for obesity or BMI. Now, poor quality sleep in children, and we've known from this from much data, it's a very active field, is that kids that don't get good sleep are tired during the day, not too surprising. They're emotionally labile, have less ability to concentrate, particularly on their studies. They have poor cognitive performance, particularly among children from lower SES families. And Joe Buchwald at Auburn has suggested that socioeconomic status is related to the achievement gap, in part due to poor sleep. And some of my colleagues in Pittsburgh actually have suggested that the gap between minorities now in achievement has gotten much, much smaller, and that the real driver is socioeconomic status. That is, in fact, the bigger factor related to achievement than race. So let me see if I want to say anything more about this. So let me move on to one more thing. So this, if you have time, I recommend reading this article. It's a very recent summary of what is known and hypothesized about the relationship of poverty to brain structures and function. And this is a very active, growing area that is very exciting because obviously if children who come from low SES environments or live in poverty don't have a chance to develop the best quality brain, then they are going to suffer many consequences. Now, why SES shapes brain development at all, 3 categories are discussed in this review: material deprivation, stress, and finally environmental toxins, and that all of that is thought to have impact on the biological mechanisms that lead to key structural and functional changes. And the review is very thorough. Just to summarize, the best data do show associations with hippocampal volume and to some extent amygdala function, and finally some prefrontal cortex and executive function measures. The authors critique the field at this point. I mean, it's an emerging field, so we can't expect it to be a mature field yet. But they note the cross-sectional nature of the data. There are few studies that are short-term follow-ups. And the third problem is a technological problem. And that is there's rapid changes in brain imaging technologies that when one wants to look at longitudinal data, it makes it very challenging to say what's really changing. So this is my last data slide. And the point I want to make is that some of these brain structures seem to be associated in children and adolescents with cardiovascular risk factors. This is a study that compared 49 adolescents with 49 adolescents with metabolic syndrome and 62 without. And metabolic syndrome is a combination of high normal blood pressure, elevated triglycerides, and low HDL cholesterol, high insulin resistance, and central adiposity. So these students didn't have frank disease, but they're clearly on their way. And they examined a number of brain indicators, and they compared them and matched them on socioeconomic status, neuropsych testing, etc. And they reported that there was a dose-response relationship between the greater the number of metabolic syndrome characteristics and smaller hippocampal volume values adjusted for intracranial volume size. It was also related to increased brain cerebral spinal fluid and reductions of microstructural integrity in the major white matter tracts. So really a strong association was demonstrated. Now this particular figure shows the association of hippocampal volume with the Quickie score, and the Quickie score is actually a measure of insulin resistance. So in this case, a lower Quickie score means more insulin resistance. And you can see in the right that there's an association between the size of the hippocampus and the Quickie score, suggesting that relatively early in life, there is an association between brain function, structure, and metabolic factors. So thus far, I have suggested that poverty and socioeconomic status is indeed connected with children's health based on the literature. Pathways could include cardiometabolic dysfunction, poor sleep, and potentially alterations in brain development. Links among these are apparent, which I think is really fascinating because it does suggest if we get to the stage of prevention and intervention that one intervention might have multiple positive effects. So a few thoughts about next steps. Most of the data are cross-sectional, and even the thought experiment that we went through, there's literature to support it, but it is, in fact, the nature of the literature is SES goes to this link, and then a separate study would go from this link to the outcome. So we have trouble in our field putting all the connections together, partly because of the nature of the data that we're working with. Impact of race and minority status I haven't said much about, but undoubtedly this is a key intersection, and we have to begin to start looking at that. There's little data looking at interactions between the physical and psychosocial stressors, and yet the data that are available suggest an interaction, that it may be more than just an additional impact, but a synergistic impact. We haven't really discussed models of childhood adversity, where I think people are starting to think about that, and it would be useful because right now, in some ways, conceptualizing SCS and poverty is overwhelming. And to narrow it down into simpler ways of thinking might be the right thing to do at this time. In this presentation, I divided the world up into home and then school and neighborhood. There's other ways to think about it that might be useful. One way that I've seen recently is an analysis where these indicators fall on two dimensions of high threat versus low threat and high deprivation versus low threat, or stated differently, resources and some sort of rank order. And then finally, there are what I call low-hanging fruit for interventions, but it takes, in a sense, public policy changes and will. I mean, obviously, if one very simple thing that now is getting more attention in the United States is lead exposure through water. And that has a simple solution, but it costs money. And that is an issue, obviously, in the, for public will. But there's also other things that can be done. Parenting, we can teach families how to help children sleep better. So there's lots of possibilities of things that can be done at this point. So I just want to congratulate people in this room that are interested in the impact of poverty and SES on children's health. I think this is a very exciting field, a very exciting time. We have lots of new tools. We have some energy. And I look forward to the next couple of days hearing the discussions and ideas that come out. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karen. It was a really great overview, and it is indeed a daunting task, but as you can see, I picked the right people to take it on. Tomorrow we will have in some sense, a parallel keynote, which is going to focus a little bit more on the psychosocial pathways. That'll also be at 9 o'clock in this room in G71. We have time for a few questions and discussion, then we have a nice adjourn outside. We'll have a nice little break and a reception, and then we'll have some more in-depth discussion, and everyone's welcome to attend, and that's in room 166. So if anyone does have any questions at this point, we'd like to ask you to come to the microphone because all the Bronfenbrenner lectures are being archived. So if anyone has a question, please come forward. Professor.
Great talk. So I wanted to ask you about your sort of thinking around your reserve capacity model and whether there have been efforts to capture the sort of cumulative aspect of reserve in the same way that people have measured cumulative risk, and if so, whether these kinds of processes have been modeled in the same sorts of studies, cumulative risk and cumulative reserve.
So, to my knowledge, cumulative reserve has not been modeled. And in our work, we've done averages, and we've tried to look at developmental periods because the parent study did collect data across key developmental periods. So we've averaged between 7 and 10, and then 10 and 13, and 13 and 16. And we do find non-significant trends where the earlier the reserves are in place, or the earlier the exposures, the bigger the impact. But we run into the issue where they're really pretty highly correlated across development. And my view is that partly we work with small samples. So our studies number between 200 and 300. So it may be if we had bigger samples. But the other view is that, in fact, these things are pretty stable, rank order, that is, relative to others. But I think it's a great idea to move that direction, especially when we have bigger samples that we can work with. And AdHealth, of course, is the one that comes to mind, where there's the potential. That's a study in the United States of a very large group of adolescents who've been followed now, I guess, into their 20s. And so there's more potential. And there's a public use data site so people can take a look at those questions. Do you know of any? Yeah.
Anyone else have a question? I guess it's a long way to the mic. Go ahead.
I can repeat the question.
Yeah, repeat the question. Thank you.
I guess I'm interested in immigration because you're talking about population, especially Mexican or other parts of Latin America, who are really stressed in their environments. I mean, they're leaving their countries because of persecution or other sorts of. And how does that tie in then with the sort of called Hispanic healthcare laws, where these kids actually seem to be doing better on all sorts of things despite these problems? Is anybody doing? It seems like that's a big population that deserves that attention.
So the point is we have the Hispanic paradox, which is that first generation immigrants from Mexico primarily do better than one would anticipate, given that they are usually lower SES. And then we have that juxtaposition with the current situation where we have immigrants who often are leaving not just economic stress behind, but also physical stress and violence. I personally don't know of what's going on in the field with regard to the latter. With regard to the former, I think that we know from a variety of studies, not just with Hispanics, that first-generation immigrants often do better than anticipated given their socioeconomic environment. And as you probably know, there's a number of hypotheses that have to do with that, that they are actually the healthier ones that will immigrate and get out, have a better outcome. But I think that's true also for Japanese, Chinese, as well as Hispanics. Do other people in the group happen to know of ongoing data with the more recent immigrants? I mean, it's a good question. I doubt if...
I don't think it's all selection. I don't think it's just healthy people moving. I think that's kind of just what I can tell from the demographic literature. But it seems like that would be a topic.
For discussion. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I obviously didn't cover was the role of the current situation in terms of violence and injury correlated with poverty and low SES. Yeah.
I have one thought on just to follow up on that issue. There's some ability to look at the question of how certain childhood stressors are clustered across poverty categories in the National Survey of Children's Health in the United States. And I worked on a study where we looked at the interaction of nativity status, so whether or not people were born in the U.S., race, and poverty. And what you see is that when you look among the poorest groups, you have much stronger clustering of childhood and family adverse experiences among poor native-born families versus poor foreign-born families. And so even though children are poor in these immigrant families, it's not necessarily accompanied with as many adversities as you see in the native-born. So that could be potentially one factor related.
Where is that published?
That's in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine with the 2011-2012
Okay.
National Survey of Children's Health.
Thank you. I might mention that I have another interest in my research over the years in cardiovascular disease in women, menopause. And one of the things we find is that the first generation women, Hispanics and Asians, actually sleep better than those who are native born. And we have ideas why that should be the case, but it is an interesting thing because if you consider sleep as a sign of restorative activity that would contribute to resilience and energy and resources, it would suggest that they do better in their non-waking hours.
Any more questions? Yeah, Martha?
Well, it was just another follow-up on this discussion, and I can't cite the study, but I'm pretty sure that diet in the United States also plays a very significant role for the second generation, right? That where the kids start catching up on obesity and diabetes, et cetera, because of the soda and the giant portions. And, I wish I could put my finger on the study, but...
Thank you for the comment. It was basically that poor diet, that when people move here, eventually they track with our bad diets. Yes?
Just a further comment on that. I think it's really important to remember that migrants come from lots of different places. For some of them, they might be coming to a more healthy environment if they come to the USA. For some, they'll be coming to a less healthy environment. You point out quite often how you're number one, or somebody indicates that you wouldn't want to be number one. And there was a study that came out of Harvard School of Public Health, can't remember the details, but showing that this was for adults, health tended to improve in the United States for those who came from more unequal countries here, but tended to not improve if they come from somewhere that was more equal. So we might in which developed countries sometimes offer a better environment for child development, but not always.
Thank you.
Just as a follow-up, there are other indicators about the healthy immigrant paradox. Low birth weight, asthma, and then there's the regression of the second and third generation. Much more typical of U.S. norms.
Can I ask a different question? I'm really interested in your concept of reserve capacity. But do you have any indication, Karen, as to why some have this and others don't? I mean, can you give us some indication of where that reserve capacity comes from?
Yeah, developmentally, in the study that I mentioned where we have followed kids, we, meaning the parent study, followed kids from the age of 6. It was a population-based sampling in Pittsburgh public schools. And these kids were followed from the age of 6 annually until they were 13, and then, no, annually all the way through, basically. And then when they got out of high school, just every couple years. And the parents, teachers, and the child were interviewed and given questionnaires. And so the things that predicted our current thinking about the concept in adulthood were the kinds of things you'd anticipate. That the parents used more positive parenting, they were closer, the kids were more involved in family activities. A big factor was the kids' achievement scores in school early on that seemed to be really important. So you get a picture of families that were very engaged in their children's upbringing and provided some monitoring and warmth. And so it's the kind of thing that I think a number of theorists are pointing to that should be factors that lead to both better health physically and mentally. So that's what I think is going on there. I think we'll hear more tomorrow about a number of other factors that seem to play a role and perhaps some of the exceptions in subgroups as well.
I think we'll move to the reception. It's out at the top. And again, thank you very much.